Hey, Sierra.
Hi, Tom.
I'm just making sure you can hear me. How you doing?
Good. I can hear you.
Great, thank you. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Statistics Solutions Chapter 1 webinar. We have a co-host on today who can kind of answer your kind of non-content related questions, anything about, where to find the webinar. You are going to get copies of it, and they are archived on our website. And I think Sierra here is posting that information right now in the chat box. If you have any questions as we're going along, feel free to type them into the chat box or into the question and answer box so you don't forget them. However, I won't get to them until the end. So we'll have, at the end of the webinar, kind of a question and answer session. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So the chapter 1 of the social sciences dissertation, our version is kind of based on the well, not our version, but what we follow is roughly the general dissertation structure, where chapter 1 is the introduction, chapter 2 is the literature review, chapter 3 is the methods chapter, chapter 4 is the presentation of the results, and chapter 5 is the discussion, which is pretty standard. There are some variations to that. So always, you're going to hear me say this several times throughout the presentation, always obtain your school's template or guidelines for the dissertation, because while there is some standardization, and what we're going to cover today is a pretty safe, standard structure for the chapter 1. There are variations, sometimes based on school, what your school wants. Sometimes the headers may be in different order. They may have different names. So always get your school's template. You can, usually you can just download that from the, the graduate school website, or your chair can give you a copy. But this, what we provide is a pretty safe general template. Okay, good. So let's get going. Chapter 1 is, just to kind of pull back and get a bigger view. Chapter 1 is the introduction to the study, and I like to think of it as the blueprint of the study. It kind of answers, 3 big questions, kind of has really conceptually 3 kind of big foci, which is the what, the how, and the why. Right, so the what is your topic. What are you studying? Right, it's going to lay that out. Why, right? The why. Why are you studying what you're studying? So what? So you're studying this topic. Okay, why? That's another big part of what chapter 1 answers. What is the rationale? What is the need? What's the research problem? What drives a study? Why is it necessary to conduct? So the what, the why, and the how, which is, how are you going to conduct it? How it's, what's the methodology? Now, most of the how is answered in chapter 3. Where you have a full chapter devoted to the methods and the methodology and all the procedures. But sometimes in chapter 1, there's a kind of forecasting of that. There might be like a nature of the study section, or a section on the study design, where you kind of inform your reader about it. And then, later you're going to go into more depth in chapter 3. But certainly the research questions appear in chapter 1. So there's some information about the how. Okay, so let's get going. All right, these are the sections we're going to cover, which again are pretty standard for the chapter. Again, get your school's template. I can't emphasize that enough, because at the end of the day, they're going to look at your chapter against the template, right? Okay, and the templates also usually give you guidance on what goes into these sections. Okay, the introduction, background, research problem, purpose, theoretical framework, definition, significance. I've kind of squished other sections. I've kind of squished a few sections into this because some schools require them, some schools don't. And then a summary. Okay. So the introduction, really just like it's the introduction to the introduction. So it's really just like it sounds. It's just going to give your reader a sense of what your study is about and why. Obviously, this is kind of, it's an introduction. So this is kind of broad strokes. You're going to go much more in depth later in later sections, about the research problem and why the study is necessary. But this is just kind of to introduce the reader to what you're doing and why. And usually, studies are based on, there's a reason to conduct them. So they're usually based on some kind of organizational issue or problem or social problem or issue. It could be, a high rate of attrition in certain type of work. It may be like special ed, if you're doing an education study, special education teachers, they're just leaving the profession at an alarming rate. And that's the organizational problem. But the study also involves the research problem, which is, okay, so we have the social problem. What is the research that's been done on it? What do we know about the topic from the research? What don't we know? What still needs to be conducted? So you want to kind of introduce this, right? The social problem. Get the reader's attention by using statistics or even a peer-reviewed source that really kind of emphasizes the depth and the severity of the problem. So if it's special education teachers leaving the profession, if you can find a statistic on it that shows your reader that it's a problem, that so much the better. If you do use a statistic, use something recent, right? Because if you use something from 10 years ago, the numbers have certainly changed. What may have been a problem then may not be a problem now, or it may be less of a problem. So, use something recent, right, to show that it's still a problem and how it's a problem now. Okay, so discuss a little bit about the social organizational problem. And then a little bit, again, this is just the introduction. So this is about a page. This is not going to be long. What you're going to be doing, what your research is going to be doing to address the problem. Okay, so what is your research problem? And we'll get into that in a few minutes, what the research problem is. So why is the study needed? State that your study is designed to address the research problem. You can end, if you want, by previewing sections of the chapter that will follow. Let's see if you have a question, but I'm going to get to it. I'll get to it at the end. We'll just come back to this section. There'll be no problem. Okay. So again, this is all kind of broad strokes. This is just to introduce the reader to what you're doing and why. So I'm, a page, maybe, give or take, maybe 2 pages, but not much more than that. But again, with the caveat of always go by what your school wants. Okay. How do I get that off? Yeah. Okay. Okay, the next section is usually the background. This is where you can go into more depth about, how do I get that off? I guess it's not a problem. Okay. The background is where you can go into more depth about your topic and the research that's been done on it, what we know about it from the research, and what's still needed. This is the place to set all this up for your reader, right? Your reader doesn't know any of this, so you have to kind of approach it from that direction as a writer. This is to inform your reader, to get your reader up to speed about, okay, where the problem has been, kind of the trends in the problem and trends in the research, and where the problem is now and where the research on the problem is now. So what is the background leading to the problem? So you're going to need some historical material here. So you want to research kind of like the trend of the problem, like where the problem's been, where it is now. But this also involves, people usually do a good job of that, and sometimes they forget to, this also involves the research, right? So it's not just a background of the problem or the topic, it's also a background on the research that has been conducted on the topic or the problem. Okay, you can't really get hyper specific, so you want to focus on kind of broad strokes, major trends in the research, what's been some of the kind of popular trends, what do we know from the research about the topic, and that should kind of lead us to what we don't know, right? So think of it as a funnel, kind of, the shape of a funnel, kind of broad at the beginning, and it kind of funnels down to something more specific at the end of the section. And what that specifically is the lack of research in the area on what you're doing, and hence the need for your study, and hence the need for the research problem, which we'll get to in a minute. So it's a background on the topic, background on the research on the topic, broad strokes, focus on trends. Basically, you're letting the reader know what they need to know to understand what you're doing and why. Okay, and so this should funnel down to the research problem. It transitions from the background. This is a more targeted overview. Going back to the background just for a minute, several pages, it's different, but usually, you need several pages to kind of set up the background. The research problem, this is shorter. This should be pretty succinct. Probably a page, less than a page sometimes. If you're going on for pages on your research problem, then that means you probably don't have a good handle on it yet, because you should be able to be pretty succinct about it. So it's a more targeted overview of recent research on your topic that highlights what still needs to be done. Transition from the background. You don't have as much historical material. Here's what we know. The recent research shows us about the topic. Here's some of the the foundational research. And that highlights what we don't know, or what the issue is, or what your research problem is. You want to also specifically state the research problem, and specifically state that your study is designed to address the research problem. Okay, now what is a research problem, right? Because there's some kind of, there's usually some lack of clarity about a research problem with the clients that come to us. They might kind of get it, but they really don't understand, so let's just go over it a little bit. And it really is what it sounds like. A research problem is a problem in the research. And what does that mean? It can be a gap. So the research problem can take different forms. It can be a gap in knowledge, right? That's a type of research problem. It's not the only kind. It could be that we just don't have the information on something. We just don't have the knowledge about something. So that's called a gap in the literature, a gap in the research. It can also be something like, we have lots of qualitative research on a topic, but no real not much quantitative research that is kind of confirming the relationship between constructs and variables, for example. Or it could be the reverse, that we have a lot of quantitative research, a lot of numbers, a lot of statistics on something, but we don't have much qualitative research. We don't have a lot of digging into, understanding the topic beyond the statistics in more depth. So we need more qualitative research on the topic. That's a kind of research problem. Or it could be that something has been approached primarily in a certain way, like using a certain theory, and other theories haven't been explored to explain it, or using only certain instruments or surveys as opposed to using, other ones. So all these things represent kind of potential research problems. And sometimes what's challenging, let's just go back to the gap in knowledge, which is one that seems to crop up a lot. We don't have, information on this topic, or we have it on this topic, but not with this specific population, for example. And so if your research is a gap in knowledge, you can't just say, hey, my research problem is that there's a gap in the knowledge. And since there's a gap in the knowledge, I'm just going to leave it at that. Right. You can't put it that way. So how do you describe something that by definition doesn't exist, right? A gap is the absence of something. The metaphor that or analogy that I have heard and used, and I think it works, is if you think of a donut, right? A donut with a donut hole. You can't describe the donut hole, right? Because it doesn't exist. There's nothing there. So the idea is, if you can describe the donut, it then highlights the absence or the center. So the same thing with the research problem. If your research problem is a gap in knowledge, right? You can't just say, hey, there's a gap. I can't say anything. There's a gap. There's nothing there. Describe the research around it. Describe the research as closely, the things that we know about the topic or the problem from the research, right? What does the research say about this topic as closely as you can get to it? And then by doing that, you frame. Then when you come and when you say there's a gap in understanding of this topic in the literature, you can show that because you've showed the literature or the research that's as close to it as you can get. So I guess the kind of the takeaway there would be is like, show that there's a gap, just don't say it. Okay, so that's the research problem. And again, probably less than a page. It needs to be pretty tight. And I would say that the research problem is one of the fundamental issues that I see with studies at the proposal level, that folks don't have a well-articulated research problem. And the research problem is important because it drives the study. It drives your need for the study. This is why the study is needed, because we don't have this information, or we need to look at a topic in a different way. So yeah, the research problem is key. Okay, the purpose, this is kind of just a statement of, it's kind of like your study in a nutshell, what you're going to be doing. And it has very specific language to it, and I have it here. I have a quantitative example and a qualitative example. It matters a little bit, but the language should be very specific. All right, and it is the purpose of this approach, design, study is to examine and explore your variables, your concepts in sample setting, right? Now, let's take an example of what that means below. So for example, the purpose of this quantitative approach, correlational design study, is to, okay, the verbs are not so important, but things like examine, investigate, even determine, those are largely associated with quantitative studies. A verb like explore is more associated with qualitative studies. So the purpose of this quantitative correlational study is to examine the relationship between transformational leadership, there's your variable, and emotional intelligence, your other variable, and then whatever sample or setting you have in high school teachers and, a Midwestern school district or something like that. And that's the language of the purpose statement. Okay, the purpose statement should start off the purpose section. The qualitative example is similar, it's just a little different. It has a different verb, explore, and it has concepts. It's the challenges of African-American women as they advance to positions as university presidents. And that's kind of a phenomenon rather than variables. But the structure is similar. The purpose statement, again, this is the purpose statement. It begins the purpose section. Whenever you need to mention your purpose in your study, throughout your study somewhere, if you need to mention it again, you always want to rephrase, or not rephrase, you always want to state your purpose verbatim, right? It doesn't change. So your purpose statement does not change. It's like your research questions. If you need to mention them again throughout the study, your research questions stay the same. They don't change. Same with the purpose statement. But that's the only time you get a pass, right? Because another, you can't just take a section of your material and kind of copy and paste it and put it in another section. That professors frown on that. You shouldn't do that. But again, the research questions and the purpose statement, you can, and in fact, you're supposed to. Okay, so and then the rest of the purpose section, again, this isn't long, maybe a paragraph or two. Check your template, but usually it includes other specific information, maybe about your variables, how you're defining your variables, a brief definition, or your major concepts, or maybe even the instruments that you'll be using to measure those variables. But it's usually not a long section. Okay, the RQs, the research questions. This is not a methods webinar, so we're not going to talk about developing research questions here, but we do offer methods webinars that do focus on research questions and developing research questions. So if you're interested in that specifically, check our website and see when we're going to be offering method seminars. But it's just enough for us to know now that usually they come next. The theoretical framework usually comes after that. A couple questions here. Theoretical framework or conceptual framework, right? You've probably seen both of those and you're wondering what the difference is. I just take a very pragmatic approach, which is theoretical frameworks are typically associated with quantitative studies, and conceptual frameworks are typically associated with qualitative studies. The next big question is, what is a theoretical or conceptual framework? What is it? You've heard it, you read about it, you've seen, looked at definitions maybe, but it's still not clear. Basically, it's the theoretical foundation or conceptual foundation that helps guide your study. It will also help kind of guide you when you're explaining your results in chapter 5. You can bring your theory in to help kind of shed some light on what you found. And this is a good, I haven't mentioned this yet, so I'm going to mention now, but for all the chapters and for all the sections, really, use your resources, come to webinars like this, use the internet, use your school. But at the end of the day, when you're sitting down writing, there's just no substitute for a good sample dissertation. So get one from your school or get one from your chair. Sometimes your chair is happy to give one to you. From your school that's closely related to what you're doing. That way you can see how people have handled these sections. And sometimes that's just, there's no substitute for that, because you can, again, use your resources, but when you go to sit down to write, you're still kind of getting that, that blank. And I think like an example dissertation or two for this section really helps. So what you want to start off by doing in this section is first just simply, state what your theory is going to be, or what your framework is going to be. Such and such theory will serve as a theoretical framework for this study. And then you want to, of course, define the theory, right? Talk a little bit about who developed it. Talk a little bit about what they developed the theory for. Theories explain things. So talk a little bit about what The theorist developed the theory to explain. Talk a little bit about what other researchers have used it for. And this is real important, how it connects to your study, right? How does the theoretical framework help guide what you're doing? Okay, so let's just take an example. Let's go back to our purpose statement, right? Let's say we're doing, the quantitative example to examine the relationship between transformational leadership and emotional intelligence. So our theoretical framework then is going to include a theory of transformational leadership and a theory of emotional intelligence, right? It needs to be as closely aligned to what you're doing as possible. Also, if you can get, in this instance, we need two theories, right? Because we have two constructs, and so we need two theories. Don't use more theories than you need. This should be pretty streamlined to what you're doing. It's not like a discussion like, hey, this theory might help explain. No, it's very much aligned to what you're doing. So if you can get away with one theory, fine. If you need two, like we do in this instance, fine, but don't go adding theories. It complexifies things. It makes your professors wonder. Then they're going to say, okay, if you're using this theory also, how does it connect to your study? Then you're going to have to connect that one. So just use what's necessary. And for like our example, since we're studying transformational leadership and emotional intelligence, those are the only two theories we need. So at the beginning could start off something like transformational leadership and the theory of emotional intelligence will serve as the theoretical framework for the study. Then you would take each theory one at a time, right? Then talk about transformational leadership. Then after that, talk about emotional intelligence. Another thing to keep in mind if you're doing a quantitative study is your theory or whose version of the theory you're going to use should align with your questionnaire or your survey, your instrument, right? So let's just take emotional intelligence as an example. There are several instruments to measure emotional intelligence. Goleman has one. He's one of the, he kind of helped popularize the term and the idea. So let's say you're using Goleman's instrument. You've determined that that's the best instrument to get the information that you want. Well, you want to use the things that you talk about in your theoretical framework about emotional intelligence should come from Goleman. Right, so it should be Goleman's theory of emotional intelligence if you're going to use Goleman's instrument. So you get that. So if you're using somebody's instrument, they all have theoretical foundations because the instruments are not developed from nothing. They're developed from theories. So Goleman's instrument, use Goleman's theory of EI. Now that the theories are going to be similar, but they're going to vary a little bit. They may have different components in them, so they're going to be variations. So don't use one person's instrument and use another person's theory. Okay, make sure that the instrument and the theoretical underpinnings align. Okay, so for conceptual framework, let's go back to what would that look like if we used our qualitative example. The purpose of this generic qualitative study is to explore the challenges of African-American women as they advance to positions as university presidents. So you might not have a theory for this, right, to cover this. So this is why they call it a conceptual framework. You're just going to have to get concepts related to that phenomenon or a concept that can act as the foundation and the guide for your exploration of the challenges these women face. And it could be a concept of, barriers to advancement, right? Let's just say barriers or racial barriers to advancement for African-American women, something like that. Some kind of something that's related to what you're doing. And that would serve as your conceptual framework, kind of a, maybe what are some of the barriers, but it should come from the literature, right? You're not just kind of making it up. So something based on the barriers that African American women experience as they advance in their careers, you could use that. You could use that concept. So that's kind of the difference between a theoretical framework and a conceptual framework. The other difference is that your conceptual framework for the qualitative study, it will also help guide your interview questions, not the research question, but like when you sit down to interview people, you're gonna have to write out questions to ask them. So your conceptual framework helps guide your questions. Okay. All right, let's move on. Nature of the study or study design is usually next. Again, this is not a webinar. I'm sorry, a methods webinar. So if you want more on like study design, we definitely have methods webinars for that. But usually it just includes a rationale for your selection of your specific design, like why did you choose that? Summarize the methodology, including from whom and how the data are collected and how data will be analyzed. And again, look at your school's template, because sometimes this section is in chapter 1, sometimes it's not. Okay, definitions. These are the terms that you're going to be using in your study that are specific to your study, right? That are your variables, your factors, your major concepts, the constructs you're looking at, everything that's specific to your study. And to set up this, it's really just a series of entries, right? And at the beginning of the section, you only really need one sentence that says, the following terms are defined for use in this study, right? And then you go on and then you list your definitions, your terms, and you define them. Alphabetize them, right? Don't have them randomly thrown in there. I think this is an APA guideline too, alphabetize them. I always say definitions should take the form of sentences. Some schools prefer sentences, some schools, it doesn't matter. I just say start with sentences instead of phrases, because somebody may ask you to turn them into sentences anyway. Definitions should be clear and succinct. This is important. Definitions are definitions, like of how you're going to use these terms in your study. They're not discussions. So, I've seen people say, well, Smith defines this term this way, and this other theorist says, no, it means something else. No, again, they're not discussions. They're usually one sentence, maybe two sentences at the most. Let's say, emotional intelligence refers to, or emotional intelligence is, and then you define it, right? And the definitions that you're going to use are going to be from the literature. They're going to be from the research. Absolutely, under no circumstances, use dictionary definitions. Okay, those are too general. The definition should come from, the literature that you're looking at, from the research. So they should have peer-reviewed support or peer-reviewed citation behind them. Sources should be recent when possible. Yeah, but that's not so important in the definitions. But recent sources is very important in your research problem. Okay, that's the definitions. All right, significance. This is the section that professors like to call the so what section. So you're doing a study on emotional intelligence and transformational leadership. So what? I mean, who cares? And they're being a little glib. The idea is that you need to talk about how the study will be significant, or what the implications, sometimes it's called the implication section. What are going to be the implications of your study? What's the significance of your study? Why is it important, and to whom, right? And Usually this has like two kind of subsections or two prongs to it. The first being, how will your study or how will what you find be significant, or what are the implications that it might have for research, right? How is it going to contribute to research or to theory? And the second one is how is it important, or why is it significant to practice? Right. So when you're thinking about the first one about contributions to research, you have to think about how might it, how might it contribute to our understanding of the topic? How might it allow researchers to think about things differently? It might change our approach to the topic. It might change our approach to the phenomenon. It might change how we think about the theory in relation to what you're doing or to the topic. So how might it add to the literature, to the research? The other one is practice. Again, same thing, but related to practice. How might your findings be important or to people at that level that do what it is you're looking at? So again, if it's an education study, your findings may have practical significance or implications for teachers, maybe for administrators, maybe for parents, maybe for students themselves. So who's the information going to be important to, and how? And of course, this section is kind of forecasting. You're not sure until you get the findings, but you're kind of looking forward to how your information may be used and valuable. Really, this is about the value of what your information, the findings you're going to get from your study, how they can be valuable. And you can kind of get nuts and bolts in the practice discussion. So for example, if this information might be helpful to, let's say, teachers, you can also talk a little bit about, how you could get that information to them through like professional development or seminars or workshops. So you can kind of get nuts and bolts a little bit at the practice level. Other sections of kind of, like I said, put together. Some of these appear in some templates. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes some of them appear. Limitations. Again, all this is kind of forecasting. You're not sure what's going to be a limitation until you actually start conducting your study. But this is just kind of asking you to think about any kind of impediments or barriers that might, or any kind of, throw a wrench in the gear of your study that would affect the results, right? To some degree, we're still dealing with COVID a little bit. I mean, that may pose some kind of limitations or make some hindrances to your study. Typical limitations for like quantitative studies involves getting an adequate sample size, right? So if you think you may have trouble getting, an adequate sample, you may put that as a potential limitation. Then you should probably talk a little bit about how you would, if that happens, what you would do in case. So you might have a proxy, group. Okay. Limitations for qualitative studies could be something like researcher bias. Sometimes people are too close to what they're doing. So you could put that down as a potential limitation. Subjectivity, researcher bias. And then if you do that, you would want to talk a little bit about how you plan to prevent or mitigate that bias. And there are strategies to do that if you kind of look in the literature, where you kind of like, you're honest about your presuppositions and your preconceived notions, and you kind of write them down and you bracket them off, right? So they don't kind of interfere with your study. Assumptions, these are things that you have to assume because you have no control over them. So the study can proceed, you just have to assume that certain things are going to be true. And the big one is that that your participants are going to answer interview questions, or if it's survey questions, they're going to answer and respond honestly and to the best of their ability, because you can't control what they say. So you just have to assume that. Scope, this is sometimes also called delimitations. It's really just the boundaries that you're setting for your study. Right. And it's going to sound a lot like your purpose. You're going to focus on a certain, population, a certain group within that population. And sometimes this is helpful. Like if you're doing an education study and you're focusing, let's just say, on parents, right? You're not focusing on students, you're not focusing on teachers, you're not focusing on administrators, just on parents. Like their perspectives. So it's, the scope is just like it sounds, if you look like, through like binoculars or, any kind of scope like that. It's what's in your study, right? What's contained within your study, and by nature of inclusion, what's excluded from your study. Usually they want, you should mention generalizability of your results in this section too. In other words, will your results generalize to the larger population, the larger target population? Qualitative studies are not meant to generalize, because they're meant to get in-depth information that quantitative studies can't get. So if that's the case, you're doing a qualitative study, you can say that, that your study, your results won't generalize, but they're not designed to. They're designed to get that kind of really in-depth, detailed information that you cannot get with quantitative studies with larger sample sizes. Now, if your study is quantitative, typically results should generalize well, but there's things that influence that. Random sampling that increases the likelihood that your results will generalize, because they're random rather than, like chosen for like convenient sampling. So that's what the scope and delimitation section is about. And I think we're at the end, at the summary. And like any other summary, you just recap major points of the chapter, right? And you want to also remind the reader of the research problem and why your study is important to conduct. And if you want, you can end by transitioning to the next chapter. Okay. And this is who we are. This is our contact information. Feel free to reach out if you just want more information about what we do. Someone would be happy to talk to you about that. All right, now let me go to the questions here. I know we've had a few from early on. I'll go back to them. Okay, the first one is, would you be able to develop the topic of your literature review based on the introduction of the research problem? The literature review, would you be able to develop the topic based on the introduction? The literature review is really, based on what you're doing, right? So I'm not sure of the question exactly, if you want to rephrase it. The literature review usually comes next, and it's it's kind of an in-depth discussion of the research that has been conducted on your topic to date, right? So the literature review not only acts as like a context, like here's the research that's been conducted, but in a larger sense, the literature review is also kind of an argument for why your study is needed, because it shows what's in the literature, what people have done, and also shows what's not in the literature, what people haven't done, and highlights, it should also highlight the need for your study. So yeah, the literature review is definitely based on your research problem. There's definitely a connection there, if I'm understanding your question correctly. Okay, here's another question. Can you please discuss the importance of assumptions? as much as I understand the importance of it, the assumptions, which is again that there are certain things you can't control, right? You're gonna ask your participants questions, for example. You're gonna send them surveys. You can't control how they answer, and you don't want to, right? That's researcher interference. So you just have to assume that they're going to answer honestly and to the best of their ability. It's a really small section. I mean, probably like a paragraph. It's kind of more important conceptually in the sense that, again, there's things you don't have control over, and you have to assume them to be able to proceed with the study. Okay, here's another one. Should both theoretical and conceptual frameworks feature in chapter 1, or should they be moved to chapter 2, literature review? That's a good question, and I didn't hit on that when I was discussing those. It depends. This is where your school's template comes in, because I've seen theoretical frameworks and or conceptual frameworks. I've seen them only in chapter 1. I've seen them in chapter 1 and in chapter 2, and I've seen them only in chapter 2. Typically, what I see the most is the conceptual or the theoretical framework is mentioned and discussed a little bit in chapter 1, and it is more elaborated on and worked out in chapter 2. That seems to be the most typical arrangement. But that's a good question. And yeah, again, this is where you would need your chair or your school's template to guide you. Okay, there is a school of thought that both quantitative and qualitative studies should have a theoretical framework, but conceptual is pro-qualitative. That would applies to both. Yeah, I don't know. Again, I take a real practical approach, and what I see a lot of is quantitative, theoretical, qualitative, conceptual. And there may be reasons to approach it differently. And again, schools have different ways to approach things. So you may be at a school or seen something a little different. That's typically what we see. Now, if a school has something else, they may be kind of distinguishing concepts from theory differently, where you can use both in one study. I don't see that a lot. Sometimes you see a conceptual framework and a theoretical framework in a mixed method study. So again, I mean, that's just kind of my take. And again, it's really kind of based on practicality rather than like a kind of theoretical discussion of them. If the study does not involve new terms, do I still need definition section? Yeah, of course, because it's not new terms, right? Emotional intelligence is not a new term, but you need to define it as you're going to be understanding the term in your study. So, for example, emotional intelligence refers to, the use of emotions to, whatever it is. Yeah, so it's not just new terms. It's things that are specific to your study that people need to understand how they're going to be operating and working in your study. So yeah, you always need a definition section. It might not be long, but it should at least contain your major factors, your variables, your major concepts. Should a qualitative study contain both a theoretical and conceptual framework? Not that I think. There's different schools of thought. I mean, obviously your chair is going to be the final arbiter, or your school, whatever they want. But again, my pragmatic take is that the qualitative study usually just involves a conceptual framework, unless there's some reason and there's some rationale for it involving a theoretical one as well. And then if that's the case, you should get some clarity about that. Okay, let's see. If the study does not involve new terms, okay, all right. exact or working definitions, contextual. For the definitions, how are you defining them for your study? I mean, again, there's no dictionary definition, so it's all comes from the literature. But again, I'm just using an example. If you're studying emotional intelligence, then you need to define it as using it for your study, right? I mean, that's kind of as specific as I can be. I mean, if you want to consider it a working definition, that's fine, because as it's working in your study, right? Yeah, but they need to be as precise as possible in relation to how you're going to be talking about them and discussing them in your study. Okay, great. Any more questions? All right, we do offer, webinars on different chapters, also on different topics. So go to our website and, see what we're offering when, and, if you want to sign up for other ones. And again, if you have, whoops, no, I got off the, if you want to talk to somebody about what we do, what we offer, let's see. Here's our contact information. Okay. Okay, any other questions? Great. I want to thank everybody for attending, and have a great rest of your day. You're welcome, everybody. All right, take care.